Hey everybody, welcome to a special edition episode of Spotlight with Sandalina. I'm your talk show host, Sandalina Sattar. Today's guest is Nitasha, who is the host for Shaam. And today, instead of doing our normal full-length episode, we're going to talk a little bit about a very specific topic near and dear to both of our hearts. We're going to talk about cycles of emotional abuse and toxic relationships in the South Asian community. There's not a lot of light shed on this topic, and I think it's something that impacts a lot of us in our upbringings and the way that we go about the world in cross-generational cycles, right? And I think there's a lot of pressure on our generation to sort of break that cycle a little bit.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about sort of your thoughts about emotional abuse and toxic relationships in the realm of the South Asian community. Is it something that you found to be problematic or seen?
Yeah, no, for sure. We obviously, I think it's very common in a lot of South Asian relationships that, we saw just like within our communities generally, right? Whether it was like parents' friends or like friends' parents or whatever. And I think like certain very specific things that I would notice at some community parties is almost like a employee and like boss relationship between like husbands and wives. And it would be very weird. Now that I think about it, I'm like, oh, that's so weird. Never a partnership. It's almost like, oh, hey, I'm going to tell you what to do and you must do it. Or like you must like explain yourself to me, or like I come from this form of authority, and it's very much like not a partnership, right?
Yeah.
And I remember specifically like remembering like that piece of it, which I thought was really weird. I don't know if you ever picked up on that.
I love that you said that because I've had that thought so many times in so many different social gatherings and settings. I understand. It's interesting, right? Because in Islam specifically, there are very clear gender roles and traits kind of assigned. And I think the religion is great in its pure form. I think what goes wrong is the cultural interpretation of these things and the way that people let sort of their own unhealthy versions of masculinity cloud the way that they practice Islam in their marriages. And one thing that I always look for when I'm kind of thinking about the realm of partnership and settling down is the number one thing on my hypothetical list is intellectual equals.
Yes.
That's all I want. I don't want to be a subordinate to somebody.
Yeah.
I think you can have different departments. One person can be more well-versed in this part of raising a household and one person can focus on this. But they're both equally important, I think. And equal respect is what's needed.
Yes. And then I think the other thing that really stuck out with me is like a woman's job to like decode a man's feelings. Like our South Asian men, especially in the previous generation, like very few of them I've ever seen just be like, oh, hey, I'm in a bad mood, or I'm upset, or that hurt me, or whatever. It would either be silent treatment.
Yes.
Or like being like, I'm totally fine. And then you lash out at something and it's like, well, where did this yelling come from? Where did this issue come from?
Yeah.
Well, why couldn't you just say like 2 weeks ago, hey, that thing really hurt me?
Yeah.
Right. And like the onus on that decoding was on the woman. Right. And there's no reason for that. Right. And the man always had to be this emotionless like person that was always fine. And that's not okay for men either.
No, it's not.
Right. And so that also like really stuck out to me as like I was growing up and watching like a bunch of like South Asian relationships, like, or, from our parents' generation.
Men aren't encouraged to articulate their emotions and feelings because it's a sign of weakness oftentimes. And this is something we see also in Western society too, for the record. But I think in South Asian, it's almost stigmatized for a man to really emote or express any sort of, so in a healthy manner. It's what's acceptable is yelling. Yeah. But what's unacceptable is just sitting down with your wife and going, hey, I didn't love that. And I never understood that.
And what's interesting is that they can express anger. So, even though that's an emotion, but there's a like carte blanche to like express anger. Everything else you cannot express. Yeah. And that is unhealthy for everyone. It's unhealthy for the children that are watching it. Like, your sons watching you are going to basically think this is how you should treat a woman, someone. Yeah. Your daughters watching you are basically going to accept that kind of treatment. Yes. Right? It's not good for your own mental health because you have a whole range of emotions inside of you. You need to let them out, right? Yeah. And your poor wife is just going to go insane trying to like deal with all of this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing that I found difficult is, you've kind of look at the parents' generation and say, okay, that's them because, they came from their, sort of upbringings. I think the thing that's always surprising to me is seeing the way that this manifests in, kind of Gen Z and millennial relationships and marriages. Yes. Is it's a cycle that repeats itself. Yes. Even in high school, college, young adult relationships and marriages, like it's something that really does occur over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one of the things, at least in our generation of relationships, I've noticed is just like the level of gaslighting that will like occur, especially in terms of like, you want to talk about something, or you want to discuss something with your partner, and they'll be like, oh, that's not a big deal. Like, that never happened.
Yeah.
Or no, that's like your interpretation of it is like totally wrong. Like, that's not, like, you're blowing it out of proportion, or it just like didn't happen at all. And you're just like left confused.
Yes.
Because you're like, oh, am I over exaggerating? Like, am I being overtly emotional? Like, maybe this is my fault. Like, maybe I should learn to let things go, right? And I'm sure there's a healthy balance. Like, you can't be stuck on every little thing. Like, life happens. Like, you need to move on. You need to let the small things go. But right now, we've almost over-indexed on this, like, just like finger pointing and gaslighting, and that doesn't help either.
Yeah. And I think one observation I've had of relationships in the South Asian community is a lot of their survival hinders on a woman's ability to doubt herself.
Absolutely.
If a woman is, maybe somebody that's a bit more confident and maybe less insecure, a lot of those relationships don't work. And the finger's always pointed at the woman. Oh, she was so outspoken. That's why it didn't work. She's too outgoing. She's too this, she's too that.
Yeah.
But what we don't see is all of the women that are trapped and, crying themselves to sleep every night and wishing for an escape that on the outside have succeeded in their marriage because there's the contract is still signed.
A lot of men in our community will, at least in this generation, will be like, oh yeah, totally down to like be with a powerful woman. Like, of course I want my wife to work. Of course I want like all of these things to happen. And then when you actually go into that practice, whether it's like, she has a job and you're job hunting, or she's earning more than you, or she has a social life and maybe, you don't, or you have less friends, or whatever the case is, right? They start nitpicking at small things.
Yes.
Right? It's like, oh, why are you traveling for work all the time?
Yeah.
Why are you always out with your friends?
Yeah.
Like, why are you always doing this? Why are you always doing that?
Yeah.
And that is not like, it's not their dad's generation where they can say, I forbid you from having a job, because that's like a faux pas now. Now it's like these death by 1,000 paper cuts that you go into.
Yes. I love that.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you're so involved in it that you don't even realize, like, oh my God, like, what kind of a situation that I'm in. Like, I'm having to travel for work, but I feel guilty because, like, now my partner, my husband, whatever, is like constantly gonna like throw that in my face. Like, I'm like getting invited to like my friends' parties, or like I'm helping with like baby showers or whatever, and now I'm gonna have to hear about it, or I have to go see my family, and now that's an issue, right? But like, they'll never forbid it. They'll just like make little comments or like make you just like feel bad about it, right? And that's such a subtle thing to notice and then to block out, or just walk out of, or just be like, I'm gonna draw my line, and like, I'm gonna do my thing, and you cannot cross that line.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, just to get a little bit more personal, because that's a big part of what we do on the show. Have you ever been in a situation with a South Asian partner where you've kind of been in an unhealthy, toxic dynamic?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Of course, I've experienced this. I've gone through a divorce.
Okay.
And so, we don't need to go into like the extreme details of that, but definitely like have felt that feeling of anxiety inside of me, have felt like the feeling of being gaslit, have felt like, in situations where I'm like, oh, like, doesn't feel right. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then moving past that. And it's not even just like, I mean, divorce was one thing. I was even introduced to guys, and like, that's like not even, something to do with my ex-husband, but like even before him, after him, to guys that would be like, oh, hey, we want you to work, but you can only be a teacher.
Oh.
Or we want you to like work, but you can only earn this much money.
Yeah.
Right. Or we need you to stay at home after we have kids. And I would be like, who are you to like ever say this to me? Who are you to tell me like what I can, and like the fundamental things I want to do with my life, what I can and cannot do with them?
And I think that's an important point. It's a lot of dictatorship, right? If somebody were to sit down with you and say, hey, listen, what do we think about raising kids? How do we want to go about that? Is there a world in which one of us stays home?
Mm-hmm.
How do we want to do the nanny thing? Do we want to bring our parents to kind of babysit? Like, having an open conversation where you can both come to the decision together.
Yes.
But when a guy points a finger and says, you home, no. That is, for me, that doesn't work either. I actually want to stay home to raise my kids one day in my life, whenever that time comes.
Inshallah, yeah.
But I would be very turned off and repulsed by a partner that told me I had to. If that makes sense. It's the freedom to choose and come to a decision together. And that, again, goes back to the intellectual equal. You have to see each other as the same level, where both of your opinions and values take equal importance in the relationship.
Yes. It was a lot easier to pinpoint toxic behavior in the previous generation because it was so overt.
Yeah.
And I think our generation, in a lot of situations, it's so much more subtle.
Yeah.
Where I said it's death by 1,000 paper cuts, where like years later when you look back, you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Right. Like this is what I've been going through. Right. And I've
Yeah.
personally experienced that feeling, and I've like gone through that like myself in like,
Yeah.
you know, my history. And it's really interesting. Yeah.
And I know we were related about this off camera too, but I've also experienced, maybe not to the same level, 'cause just by virtue of how old I am, but I've experienced also like very unhealthy relationships and situations. You grow up seeing one thing in, you know, households across your whole community.
Right.
And then you start kind of thinking, oh, maybe this is normal, maybe this is okay, but it's really not okay.
What are some toxic behaviors you learned
Yeah.
as you observed relationships in our previous generation?
I think my view of love has been skewed from a very young age. I don't think I ever saw a good example of it. I saw great examples of familial love, right? The way my parents loved me was amazing. But I don't think I ever saw a healthy romantic love growing up, not just in my household, but even the households that I was kind of exposed to, the family friend dynamics. My perception's been, very skewed. I don't think I understood that love could mean peace, that it could be restful, that it could be something that brings you joy. I think I've always seen it as something that's a cause of anxiety, unrest, argument, yelling, swearing, breaking dishes. Like that's what I thought love was for the longest time.
Wow.
I would see kind of fairy tale romances in TV, and I was like, well, that's for white people. That's not for brown people.
That's not brown people. Yeah.
Like we don't get that happy ending, because why would we, right?
Yeah.
So I think it was a lifelong journey of kind of unraveling that as time went on.
Yeah. So when did you notice that type of love was not really love, but just these toxic traits? When did that click? And, you know, how did that translate?
I always knew logically. I was like, oh, like this probably isn't right. But I didn't really understand what good was supposed to be. I think it was when I had my first experience in partnership, when I was in high school, when I started symptomatically experiencing some of the similar behavior patterns that I'd kind of seen growing up. And I just remember thinking, you know, this doesn't feel good. This really just doesn't feel good. I feel awful all the time. And I don't think I fully realized it then. I think it took going through it a second time later in college to then say, you know, this is a pattern of not good. And there are very similar sort of reactions that I have across these two situations, even though they're years apart.
Right.
Therapy. Then I started going to therapy. And that's when I realized like this is much bigger than me.
No.
How did you pull yourself out of those situations?
Oh gosh, it is hard. It is literally the hardest thing I've had to do. And I like lost my father at 21, and I thought that was hard, right? Of like him randomly just getting diagnosed with cancer and passing away in the course of 6 months, right? And like that, like this was a whole other level of difficulty, right? Like because for me, it was right at the like start of COVID. Yeah. Everything was locked down. I couldn't leave.
You're trapped.
I'm trapped. Literally, my family cannot physically come to me. I cannot go to them. Yeah. So there was this isolation piece that was around it. At the time, like, you know, my support system was also being like, it was really interesting to get their reaction because I don't think they had fully reconciled what was happening. Yeah. And so there was a lot of comments coming from them of like, oh, are you sure this is the path you want to go down? Are you sure? Have you thought through this? Oh, well, do you know because of this decision of yours, like I now have to tell my kids about what divorce means?
Oh God, are you serious?
Yeah. And these are girls like in our generation, right? They're younger women, right? Yeah. Or like, oh, you know, like maybe, are you sure this really happened to you? Like, are you sure you're not exaggerating? Like, are you sure this is happening? And so there was so much of that. And to literally like put all of that aside and be like, no, I'm going to do this. Like, this is not right for me. And
listen to yourself.
Like, listen to myself. And like, I'm going to walk out of this. And literally, it's like I put my emotions on pause. And I was like, what are the 5 things I need to do in order to make this happen? Right? Like, I need to know my finances are in order. Yeah. I need to have a place to live. I literally need to go find where I'm going to live. Yeah. Right? I need to go find my own mode of transportation because like we shared transportation at the time. And so it was like, okay, go get place, a car, you know, figure out like your finances, create a spreadsheet, like quite literally a spreadsheet of like, what are all the bills and like, how are you going to make this work? And like, what is your budget for everything? And then like go and just like execute. Like when you're ready, you just go execute on it. I had my process of therapy. I had my process of like, you know, going through all of that. It took me a long time to be ready to even like consider being in a relationship again, right? Yeah. Let alone like finding someone, feeling like I'm ready for marriage with that person and starting that journey again. Like all of that is very challenging, right? Yeah. But in that moment, very practical. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And it's like, maybe it's not the best advice, but for me, it worked because if you had gotten that emotion, if I had gotten that emotional piece mixed up of like, oh, like maybe I should give it a try, maybe I should continue, whatever, like I would have never done it.
The story that you shared, by the way, thank you for sharing.
Yeah,
because I know divorce is a very, very taboo topic in our community, unfortunately. And oftentimes the woman is who gets ostracized coming out of it, even though it takes two to tango. No, thank you for sharing. And I love what you kind of outlined about the logistical element of it, because I think that, like you said, it is a very emotionally tumultuous situation. But if you have the ability to just pause for a second and actually think rationally and say, okay, how do I actually get out? Like, what does that actually mean? What does that actually entail? Right.
Yes.
In my case, I'm thankful that I wasn't in a situation where, you know, my life was intertwined with anybody where I had to leave.
Right.
But even then, leaving was difficult.
So what were some traits, like very specifically, that you discovered in therapy that helped you identify love versus like a toxic or abusive behavior?
It's very important to listen to yourself and trust your gut. So when something doesn't feel good, listen to it. What I would do oftentimes, that I think a lot of Muslim women specifically do, is when you find someone that, you know, aligns with your family in a certain way, you start attributing the importance of success to external factors that aren't necessarily between you and the partner, but it's between you and the community. Oh, you know, this person's Muslim, so I have to make this work, right? Or this person gets along really well with my parents, so I have to make this work. What I realized is it's ultimately about you and your feeling, and it's also being able to use the word toxic and emotional abuse to describe the situation. I think for the longest time, I was defending my former partners because I would say to myself, you know, they're really good people. I know where they're coming from. I know their heart. I know why they are the way they are. It took me years to just kind of say, this is what it actually is. And I'm happy to go into depth either way, by the way. But
I mean, I would love to unravel some of those traits, because I think it's really easy to just have this general conversation about, oh, like it felt toxic, it felt what, but I'm sure a lot of Muslim women watching, or just any woman watching, like that is going through that feeling, is like, well, what is an example of a trait that you came across that you were like, oh, this is a bit toxic, right? Or what are examples that you've learned from research, perhaps, that do come up as like, you know, something that may be defined as emotional abuse?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what helped me really pinpoint it was therapy and reading articles online. I know you shared a stat earlier that I'd like you to share on this show as well. What's the stat?
Yeah, so the stat is it usually takes 7 times before you can, 7 tries before you can actually walk out of a relationship.
That's crazy. Yeah. That is actually crazy. So you know, that adds up. And I remember kind of being stuck in that back and forth, and therapy was kind of got me out. And again, my escape had to be more emotional, thankfully. There were articles that I was reading at the time that kind of outlined, you know, this is what an emotionally abusive relationship looks like. This is what a toxic relationship looks like. And by the way, I hesitate to use those words because I think a lot of those times those words are overused in sort of Gen Z media to sort of like
100%.
Make fun of men or make fun of women. And so that's why it was really hard for me to even use that terminology, because I was like, oh, this is such a buzzword that people are just overusing, and I feel weird using it. It took me a very long time to say those words. And now I can say them confidently, you know, sparingly. I don't like to overuse it. But the point is, there are a lot of traits. I want to play a sad game.
Okay.
I'm going to read out the traits.
Okay.
And if either of us have related to it, we just raise our hand.
Okay.
This is a definition from the National Domestic Violence Hotline. This is a definition of emotional abuse. I'm going to pause at every word, and then we raise our hands if it applies. Emotional abuse includes non-physical behaviors that are meant to control, isolate, or frighten you. This may present in romantic relationships as threats, insults, constant monitoring, excessive jealousy, manipulation, humiliation, intimidation, and dismissiveness. Sorry, this isn't funny. It's just sad.
Yeah, it's just sad. At this point, it's just sad.
Okay, and then there's another article from Women's Health Magazine, 24 Signs You're in a Toxic Relationship and Need to Let Go. I'm just going to read off a few. Your significant other always finds something wrong with you. That was a big one. I felt like I was in situations where I was constantly being picked at, that, you know, you're too much like this. You're too much like that. I wish you would be this way. I wish you would be that way. And it never felt constructive. It always felt like it was something meant to tear me down.
Put you down. Yes. Criticize you.
They strip away your self-esteem. So they kind of pinpoint your insecurities and amplify that and use that to drill you down to the ground and break you into a million pieces to where you feel like you're nothing. And then reverse it and then build you back up
so they can tear you down.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So I realized I was getting into these cycles where my self-esteem started becoming linked to the way that my partner viewed me by virtue of the fact that they were the ones controlling my perception of self. Right.
Right.
Bonus points if they use that to build it back up and make you feel better. There's a clear imbalance of power. For example, somebody's always apologizing more than the other. They're controlling and excessively jealous. Sort of. Yeah, a little bit. So this jealousy point, I started acting like that too. I'll be the first to say I'm very embarrassed of the way that I was in my past relationships. I was not a good partner either. But I think that you imitate kind of what you see. And that's why it's hard to pinpoint it, because it's a cause and effect relationship. Now it's pinpointing who's the cause and who's the effect.
Right.
So that's one thing. The controlling and jealousy thing, it's not good. You're not practicing self-care. I stopped caring about myself.
Okay.
I stopped having ambitions. I stopped feeling like the need to like look nice or do anything. I had completely become a shell of a human. Even my friends, if anybody of them are watching, they can recall these times in my life. Whoa. It was not good. Yeah. Not good at all. Yeah. You're not practicing self-care, meaning you've completely let yourself go.
Oh, I've had that.
You keep waiting and hoping for them to change. You feel very insecure. Now, this is a hard one, because this is something that can oftentimes be used against you. Yes. Oh, you're so insecure. You're so crazy. You're always blah, blah, blah. But really, there's some insecurity that's maybe internal that we all have as human beings.
Sure.
But I think there's a big delta. When you're kind of in an unhealthy relationship, that gets amplified to a level to which it would never be if you're with a healthy partner on your own.
I think a really good example of it is that, say you express a need to your partner. Like, oh, I really like it when you do this thing, right? Yeah. And rather than doing that thing, it could be a simple thing like, oh, you warm up my coffee in the morning or something, or it makes me feel loved if you, you know, like write me a card on my birthday or something like that. And they don't deliver on that. And they're basically like, oh, you should be secure enough.
Yeah.
You should be secure enough in yourself that you don't need that. Like, why do I need to do anything to validate my love? That's your insecurity.
I've heard that one.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. That's like a very specific, like, if you're going through that, then know that like what is happening is toxic and it's not your insecurity. You're literally being very clear about how you like to be loved. And you're being told like, oh, like you cannot be loved in this way because you're just insecure. Like that's your problem.
And especially when your demands are reasonable, right? If you're demanding like, oh, like I would love if we took a $10,000 vacation to Europe every year. Okay, that's annoying.
That's not it.
But little acts of kindness. Like I love when you like show a listening ear in this specific instant.
Yeah.
Like I love when you do this little thing, like you said, the coffee in the morning.
Whatever.
Things that take 30 seconds.
Tiny little things.
Tiny things.
Yeah.
Next one, your partner is constantly stonewalling you. So they're constantly shutting down. Your family and friends are concerned. You often feel worse when you're with them. You feel drained by the relationship. You don't feel positive about the future with them. And you're always making excuse for their behavior. Yeah. Okay. So, we passed the test, unfortunately.
I would love to just hear about, again, very practical steps that someone can take as they're watching this. Maybe they're identifying